Robin Hood, the very name conjures up images of myths and legends. But what happens when you take those myths and legends apart and look at the actual historical evidence? Who is the real Robin Hood? We're talking about Robin Hood, so what are we doing here in Chester? Well, the oldest reference, which is in a book called Piers Plowman, written in 1362, refers to Robin and the Earls of Chester. So Ranulph, the 3rd Earl of Chester, was based here at the castle behind me and is obviously a key player in the story of Robin Hood. In 1127, the first Grand Master Hugh de Payens visits Europe and the UK to rally support for the crusading Templars, the medieval equivalent of a military recruitment drive. At this time he comes north to Chester and meets the barons and earls, the very same barons and earls that appear in the legends of Robin Hood. In 1153, Ranulph, Earl of Chester, who would have met the Templar Grand Master Hugh, was poisoned by a rival, Peveril, Lord of the Peak District. This Ranulph was instrumental in securing Henry II to the English throne, for which he was granted many Staffordshire and Warwickshire lordships, and among these were the estates of someone named Hod, whose daughter inherited the lordship of Locksley. One of the few surviving buildings that Robin would have been familiar with is Chester Cathedral. The barons and the earls of Chester who surrounded Robin chose Chester Cathedral as their burial place, and they have a very distinctive style of tomb. Several examples of which are here in the cloisters. The tombs have a very distinctive circular cross that appears to combine 4 of the Celtic torque bracelets into one. It's one of those symbols that would have been very familiar to the Knights Templar. As we journey across the various counties associated with Robin, this type of burial can be used to identify the various churches and monasteries associated with the Earls and Barons of Chester. It is said that Robin Hood was born at Locksley in the county of Nottingham in the reign of King Henry II about the year 1160. His birth name is sometimes recorded as Robert Fitzooth, but this is almost certainly a later invention, and he is frequently styled the Earl of Huntington. However, this could be a pun on Hunting Town, meaning simply the forest. So what about the famous Locksley? We decided we were going to try and search for the village of Locksley, and sure enough, there on the map is this place called Locksley, right next to Doveridge. And guess what we find when we get here? Some kind of medieval village? No, we find a lay-by with a cafe in it, because in the period of the last 1,000 years or so, Locksley, the medieval village, has completely disappeared. Chartley Castle is the closest administrative seat to the supposed Locksley where Robin lived, and is one of the virtually unknown castles built by the Earls of Chester. One thing which becomes obvious to any researcher early on is that Robin's land holdings seem to correspond well to those of the Earls of Chester, indicating a possible noble military or family link early on. The place name Locksley also appears among these lands in Staffordshire, Warwickshire, Derbyshire and Yorkshire. When looking at the various sites associated with Robin Hood, it can become something of a tangled web, so we came to speak to an expert in the geography of Robin Hood. So, how did you get interested in Robin Hood?
Well, I live in Leek, which is originally part of the Earl of Chester's lands, and he got land in 20 counties as well as Cheshire. And I came across a quote from Piers Plowman all about the legends of the Earl of Chester and Robin Hood, and the two seemed to be so linked, and it started fascinating me that the two should be together. And I started investigating different sites, and some of it didn't seem to make sense because there's Robin Hood's Bay in the north, and in the Peak District there's all these Robin Hood sites, and it's a fair way to Nottingham, where everybody thinks Robin Hood came from, Robin of Locksley in Nottinghamshire. And then, looking on the map, there's more than one Locksley. It began to make sense when I looked into a book on Ranulph, Earl of Chester, and at the back of the book there's all the lists of the villages and the honour of Cheshire. And it's county by county, and some of these places all sort of linked together with the Earls of Chester.
We pick up Robin's story around the year 1176 to 1186, during which Robin is said to have been wild and extravagant, resulting in bad debts, for which he becomes an outlaw and lives in the woods. These woods are said to include Barnesdale in Yorkshire, Sherwood in Nottinghamshire, the Peak District, and sometimes Plumpton Park, Ingleton in Cumberland. Early sources always style Robin simply as a yeoman standing against his noble oppressors. Like all good knights, he is, however, devoted to the Virgin Mary. He does not rob the rich to give to the poor in the early ballads. He simply engages in shaming contests that show characters up for what they really are. He is more concerned with upholding audacity, charity and courtesy, virtues found in the codes of knights. Never at any other time in human history have we had the sort of resources available that we have now with the internet. It connects libraries and document repositories all over the world. So it means that we can look at Robin in an entirely new way. We can get together all the information that's known and produce a final synopsis. Do we have any kind of idea who Robin is? Well, there's so much documentation out there that is available, we can wheedle down the names slowly till eventually we come back to the original Robin. And the amazing thing is, the original Robin is there in the 12th century as a single individual that starts the whole ball rolling. We came to speak to an online historian about what's out there on the World Wide Web. Having the internet that we have today, you've almost got limitless resources, so presumably the place where you start is to go back to the oldest written sources that we have.
If I'm asked to do Robin, this is basically what I do. I'll look at Robin on the internet and just see anything I can get hold of, and yes, I will. I'll go to what was the first major book that was out about him, or then I'll go into historic records and find out what Robin Hood was, say, in court rolls from the early 1100s, 1200s.
Having looked at all of those sources, can you remember what the oldest source you managed to find was? What sort of date range does that sit in?
Not long after the conquest, 1066, there's evidence of a Robin Hood down near Cheltenham being fined for something, but it was obviously not our Robin Hood. But that's the earliest I've got.
So the name Robin Hood actually predates the stories?
Absolutely.
Another popular misconception is that Robin only operated in Sherwood Forest as we have it today. Back in the 12th century, the forest stretched all along both sides of the Great North Road, the Roman Watling Street, and Robin moved north and south along this boundary as circumstances dictated. What seems to be emerging then is a pattern of various teams with various agendas. For example, we have the Red Team, which is Richard's team, which seems to be supported by the Templars, and they've managed to enlist the assistance of the Welsh and the Scots. And then we have the Blue Team, which seems to be the supporters of John, who later in life joins a crusading organisation, one which is not specified. Well, it could be the Hospitallers, or it could just be one of the other organisations. And then, trapped in the middle, we have Robin and his foresters, another team which we may as well call the Green Team, because they're in the forests, trapped between the Red Team and the Blue Team.
In that period, a lot, should we say, serfs, peasants of the village at that time were not actually allowed to go out without the Lord say so. But one of the people that could travel around the country was minstrels. These minstrels would go from town to town and they would sing information, news about an early town crier, basically. But he would remember what as he's been told, and by song, and he'd sing it, and that's your legends, that's your internet of the day. And they became legends, and then these legends were written down, hence the Robin Hood stories.
Written legend continues his story in the forests of Barnesdale, accompanied by Little John, where they capture a poor knight who has lost his son after his son slew a knight of Lancashire. John goes to the Sheriff of Nottingham and demonstrates his sword and archery skills, and the Sheriff is inspired to hold an archery contest, which in the original legends includes Little Joan, Robin Hoode, Gilbert Whitehand, Scatheloak, Little Much and Good Reynold. At the archery contest, the outlaws are recognised and flee to the castle of the poor knight Richard at the Lee, who is then arrested. The evil sheriff is then killed by an arrow from Robin and the sheriff's men defeated. A pardon from the king follows, and Robin builds a chapel in Barnesdale dedicated to Mary Magdalene. This is St Peter's Church here at Kirk Smeaton, and in the stories of Robin Hood it's said that he founded a chapel here in medieval times, and this quite frankly is the only medieval chapel anywhere in Barnesdale along the side of the A1. Only a knight would be pardoned for killing a noble based on the evidence he gave, and only a warrior monk would be able to build an approved chapel and be allowed to dedicate it to Mary. Robin is fighting for King Richard. Nottingham Castle and its sheriff has rebelled and broken away from the crown. In the early tales of Robin Hood, he's a far more violent character than the character of today. He kills several different sheriffs of Nottingham. He kills a monk and the monk's page, and ultimately in a duel he kills Guy of Gisborne, cutting off his head, sticking the severed head on the end of his bow and mutilating the face so that Guy is no longer recognisable. So when you were looking at specific sites, were there any that stood out as being related to Robin?
where the castle is, at Castleton, and you look down the Hope Valley to near Hathersage, above there is Robin Hood's cave.
That is actually in quite an interesting geographical position, isn't it?
Well, if you know the area around Hathersage, there's these great long millstone grit edges that separate Derbyshire from Yorkshire. And Robin Hood's cave's on Stanwich Edge, and the top of the edge is in Yorkshire, and the bottom of the edge is in Derbyshire. So the front of the edge is, well, where is it? Robin Hood's cave is in that front of the edge.
So it was an absolutely perfect place to hide because it sits between two counties. In an evidently unpopular move, at some point in 1189, King Richard assigns the revenues of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire to his brother John. Maybe this is the reason the old sheriff had to go, out with the old and in with the new. This is Robin Hood's Stride. It's an enormous rock outcrop just near Yulegreave in Derbyshire, and it's pretty obvious why it's got connections to Robin Hood. It's exactly the kind of place you would expect Robin to come to have a look out across the nearby medieval road. To the untrained eye, this might just look like a normal footpath. Maybe it's been trampled by cows or fell walkers or something like that, but in actual fact what you're looking at here is a sunken medieval roadway. It's known as a hollow way, and it leads away from Robin Hood's Stride and off into the woods over here to a very important location indeed. What we have here is an extremely rare survival of the early medieval period, probably the 6 years or so when the Pope excommunicated John and most religious establishments were closed. Built between the two yew trees is a forest chapel, a hermitage, a sort of little tiny religious establishment built into a cave, and at the back of that cave is a wonderful survival of a crucifix, complete with the figure of Christ carved onto it. And it is an incredibly rare survival from the times when Robin and his men would have been here in the forest. What do you think the relationship was then there between Richard and John? Because the more you've looked at the geography, the more it's showing that the two seem to have taken separate sides and different pieces of geography as their own.
There's a statue of Richard the Lionheart outside the House of Parliament, and he's one of our great leaders, but is he? I mean, let's face it, history shows he's actually only spent about 3 months of his life over here and he couldn't speak English. And most of the time he was away on crusade. Now, who was paying for all this? It was the British people as well. So John is considered a bad king. But was he? Was he a bad king? He was just trying to get some money back into the coffers because Richard had took it all. And it's been proved by other scholars that he was very good at administration. And basically that's what he was doing. Well, there's probably some people who knew this and understood it. But to be honest, I think that the barons and the lords that had been on tour, the Crusades, come back and was used to Richard's way. They didn't like this at all. They wanted to live the life the way they already did. And I think they were told by Richard, don't kill John, basically, he's my brother, just put up with him, basically. Do as he says. I'll need some money when I get back anyway. And I think it was as simple as that.
In October of 1187, Saladin, leader of the Muslim armies, recaptures Jerusalem, and 2 years later in 1189 is faced by the Third Crusade. King Richard the Lionheart takes the throne and immediately heads to the Holy Land with Philip of France. In January 1193, John concludes a treaty with King Philip and tries to seize the English throne while Richard is away on crusade, and is stopped by Richard's justiciars. Richard is then shipwrecked and imprisoned by Emperor Henry VI of Germany, apparently costing his brother John a huge ransom extracted from England during 1194. Scottish writer John Major states that during the time Richard was held captive, Robin Hood was outlawed. It is then recorded that, full 13 years and something more, these northern parts he vexed full sore. In his entire reign, King Richard spent only 7 months in England, 5 months in 1189 and 2 months in 1194. The medieval fresco here at Clovelly shows what is thought to be King Richard's Third Crusade. We come to the parish church of Melbourne, just south of Nottingham, because behind me is possibly one of the best preserved Norman period churches anywhere in Britain, and this is exactly the sort of place Robin would have come to, if not actually the place Robin came to. And in here is one of the forester's tombstones that's almost identical to the one shown on Robin Hood's grave. There survives an illustration of Robin's grave from the 1600s, and there also survives a very similar tombstone over at Heathersedge where Little John's buried. And there's another one, another forester's tombstone hidden away behind furniture here in the vestry at Melbourne. The church here at Bakewell is absolutely exceptional. Housed in the porch is one of the finest collections of Saxon and medieval stonework. It contains many burials of foresters from the period of Robin Hood. These tombs can be used as examples of the sort of things knights in the days of Robin were being buried under. And more pertinently, they come from the same area that Robin is associated with. These tombs were collected from sites all over Derbyshire. While searching for sites associated with Robin Hood, it's equally appropriate to look at the sort of things that would have been associated with him. For example, here in the village of Tong, the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar both had foundations, one a hospital and the other a magnificent church. What we're seeking here is a tiny forester's chapel, very similar to the sort of chapels that Robin would have been familiar with. What we seek is housed in one of the side chapels. The church is rightly famous for its effigies, but most of the effigies contained here are later than the period that Robin would have been alive in. That's not to say that when he eventually was buried, that he wouldn't have been buried under an effigy, maybe something similar to the one we see here, except with armour from a much earlier period. While the church was being restored recently, a doorstep was overturned and a Templar altar stone was discovered. These are extremely rare, as many of them were broken up during the dissolution of the monasteries, and this is a particularly fine example, having 6 Crusader crosses carved on its sides and one magnificent Templar cross right in the centre. So what of Robin Hood's band of merry men in the early tales? Well, as you might expect, you've got Little John, you've got a William Scathelock, who later becomes Will Scarlet, or possibly, they could be 2 brothers. You've got a guy called Georgia Green, you've got Much the Miller's son, but only in the later legends surviving do we have Friar Tuck and Maid Marian. They've become something of a mystery, because they don't seem to appear in the really early legends, but they're there nevertheless. Richard lands back in England in March 1194 on his second visit and heads to London, then on to Nottingham, which surrenders to him after 3 days and its defenders seek his mercy. By Easter he has moved again to Northampton. 8 days later Richard receives the crown from Hubert Walter, Archbishop of Canterbury, in the presence of King William of Scotland. But by the 12th of May he was off again, leaving Portsmouth for Normandy, where he met his brother John, who fell at his feet seeking clemency. This clearly shows how far the relationship between them had deteriorated, and presumably that of their respective supporters. In our investigations we've entered the tangled world of medieval nobility and royalty, so I've come to speak to historian Helen Carr about the relationship between John, Richard and their respective supporters. What do you think the relationship then in this country would have been between the supporters of Richard and the supporters of John?
Richard was away fighting the Crusades and John was left in England and France. And whilst John was constantly seeming to be scheming to overthrow Richard to become king in his own right, I think Richard was actually very aware of this and would send sort of some of his closest allies and supporters and friends over to see exactly what John was up to. So John secretly at one point was trying to overthrow William Longchamp, who was the treasurer. As soon as he got wind of this, he sent over Walter of Coutances, Archbishop of Rouen, to come and sort of take hold of the situation and bring John to heel, which is exactly what he did.
Do you think the general population would have been aware of the situation?
Yes, I think they would have done. I think the barons were getting very fed up. I think they were sick of being taxed. They were losing money when they felt like they shouldn't be. And John didn't have this sort of heroic image that Richard had. It was sort of what are we being taxed for? His mistakes.
How do you think the ordinary man in the street would have viewed the conflict then between Richard and John?
Well, as Richard was, he was away, he was this iconic king. He was this figure that a lot of people, I think, could elaborate in their minds as this hero king, this warrior king who was off fighting for God, fighting for a cause, and there was John taxing them. I mean, who's going to really be more popular in the common person's mind?
So if there was an opportunity for Robin to meet Richard, do you think he would have gone out of his way to do so?
Oh, I would have thought so, yes.
In the entire of the life of Robin Hood, the story only tells us that he spent 3 days here at Nottingham, and that is in the presence of King Richard the Lionheart, who's besieging the castle of Nottingham, which is standing against him and his order. Behind me is the only bit of the modern-day Nottingham Castle that Robin would have recognised, and it's possible that through this gateway to the outer keep rode King Richard when he sieged Nottingham Castle for 3 days in March 1194. The old monk's brew house which served the castle has been rebuilt here many times, but the old original caves still remain. Legend has it that when the 3-day siege of Nottingham Castle came to an end, King Richard retired here to the Old Trip to Jerusalem pub, where he met with Robin and commissioned Robin to act on his behalf while he was away on crusade.
My main concern is the safety of my men. But if it can be done, we will ensure. You have my bow.
So you have got these two opposing teams. You've got Richard's team with all his supporters, and you've got John's team with all his supporters. And what's happening here in the north of England is the two sides meet with Nottingham trapped in the middle. Are you finding that the geography, the castles and the forests, are backing that situation up and supporting the standoff between the two sides?
If you come up further up north to Nottingham area where you're supposed to be, you look what castles there are there. This is what I did. So what barons are there? So I looked and checked all the castles and who owned them. And funny enough, I started to notice a line going across the country, and it led to Chester, the Earl of Chester. Now, what was he doing with all the castles going across the country? And you can see a line coming from Chester straight across the country towards Lincoln of castles. A line coming straight down. Then you start noticing another line coming the other way from Lincoln down to South Wales. And recently I've been noticing a line coming from Chester up through Rochdale to North Yorkshire. The picture is forming there that all John is left with is the southern part of England and the eastern part of England.
Robin Hood and King Richard really get on well together and hit it off. As a result of this, King Richard decides that he's going to make Robin a knight. King Richard was a member of the Order of Templars, and it's perfectly reasonable to assume that Robin would also have joined the same order. The order has a certain ritual in which the sword is presented and oaths are sworn, after which Robin would have been presented with his own surcoat and his own set of armour. Richard grants Robin permission to marry Marianne and obtain her lands at Malaset in the Lancastrian Marches, where he settles as a squire and servant of the crown for the next 16 years. Do we have any more evidence to say that Robin Hood was a knight? Well, yes, actually we do, because despite the fact he kills so many people, he's nearly always forgiven. He's also allowed to build 2 chapels, one up in Scarborough and one in Sherwood. And the other thing is, what's he doing serving a king if he's not a knight? He's there defending the royal forests on the border between King Richard's lands and the lands of King John. So the position we find Robin in the stories, it's not something unusual.
No, it was absolutely some sort of forester to be able to do that. The story says he wore green clothes. Now, we've seen this on the Bayeux Tapestry. The English archers, they're actually wearing green and brown.
So when these guys looking after the forest actually got involved in the conflict, what style of warfare were they waging?
Oh, it's going to be guerrilla warfare, isn't it? They've got everything they need there. They'll just melt into the forest.
So the Robin we get in the stories is very much more a guerrilla warfare character.
It's obvious, isn't it, basically? That's what he was, a forester.
In 1797, John Throsby recounts in the Antiquities of Nottinghamshire:
At the house we were formerly shown several things said to have belonged to Robin Hood, but they are frittered down to what are now called his cap or helmet and part of his chair. As these things have passed current for many years, and perhaps ages, as things once belonged to that renowned robber, I sketch them.
Based on our investigations, it appears that the idea that Robin was born in Nottingham is just a misconception. Most of the ancient antiquarians agree that it was in fact Loxley in Staffordshire. By April, Richard is back in France. Most of Robin's younger followers serve King Richard in his French wars and die or settle on Robin's lands on their return. In 1196, the actual historic figure Robert Fitz-Odo, who is often thought to be a candidate for Robin Hood, as he is Lord of Loxley Manor, is recorded as being dispossessed. He also spends a year as an outlaw robber until King Richard restores his lands. Although it is unlikely that this is the real Robin Hood, it shows that the disagreements between northern nobles and the crown continued long after Richard's visit here.
We know there was a meeting round about 1198, I think, round about just before Richard died. There was a meeting of the barons there. They were talking, how could they get rid of John? How could they push him out? How are they going to deal with him? And I think basically what they did was silent warfare, in as much as they had their archers in forests. It's as simple as this. When John's fellas came and tried to grab money, they grabbed it back.
Then on the 6th of April 1199, King Richard died from a crossbow wound while besieging Chaluz Castle in France, triggering the problems with the wicked King John. This is the giant yew tree at Doveridge Church, and it's said that Robin Hood married Maid Marian, or Clorinda as she was known in that particular story, under this very tree. And it's very possible that that was the case. This illustrates perfectly the way we've arrived at some of the sites we feature in Robin Hood. This yew tree is said to be at least 1,400 years old, so there would have been a significant yew tree here in medieval times. It's also possible that the wedding took place during the 6-year period when John was excommunicated by the Pope, and religious establishments all over the British Isles were closed down as a result. And that would very neatly explain why, while still being on a religious site, they got married out in the open under this yew tree. Said Robin Hood, "O lady fair, where do you go? O where do you go, fair lady?" And she answered him, "To kill a fair buck, for tomorrow is Titbury market day." When dinner was ended, Sir Roger the parson of Doveridge was sent for in haste. He brought his mass book, and he made them hold hands, and he joined them in a marriage which was strong. The original language in which this story was written is thought to indicate a 14th century date, which is early enough for it to be authentic. So, having been together for so many years, why does Marianne and Robin decide to get married at this point? Well, it's simply to carry on the family name, carry on the name of Robin Hood in the medieval tradition. So there's somebody there to inherit everything that Marianne and Robin build over the years. And sure enough, within a couple of years, they have in fact got a son named Robin Hood. Almost next door to Doveridge is this little village called Tutbury, and when you get here you automatically assume that there's nothing here, until all of a sudden in the middle of the village you discover there's a castle. Now the significance of all this is that this is where Friar Tuck is thought to have come from, Tutbury, and right adjacent to the castle we have an ancient Norman church just to support that. Of course in the past it was known as Titbury, which is why Friar Tuck has been politely changed to Tuck. When you've been reading the original tales of Robin Hood, presumably you've gone through each one of those tales and picked out whatever relevant geography there is, and then applied that to the maps at your disposal.
Robin, as a young farmer, travels 40 miles to Lincoln Fair. So if you get a map and you put an arc 40 miles away from Lincoln, you come to a couple of interesting places. One of the most interesting places I find is Tutbury.
Is that where Friar Tuck came from?
There is a Belgian monastery, and they had friars at that particular time. So I had to have a look at this Belgian monastery and found out that they helped the Crusaders coming back from the wars. So there were these Crusaders coming back, starving, battered, injured. The friars would help them and take them across. And I think Friar Tuck was come from a Belgian monastery over here. And he mentions in one of the court rolls that King John did actually give an area of land to a particular friar at that time. So there were friars in the country at that time, and John knew him.
It's thought that the original character Friar Tuck, or Friar Tuck, was based here at St Mary's Priory in Tutbury. He wasn't always based here, because by the days of Robin Hood he's obviously moved on, as history has the habit of doing. On the 27th of May 1199, King John is officially crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. In 1200 he concludes the Treaty of Ligoulet, accepting Philip of France as his overlord in Normandy and the Angevin on condition that Philip accepts John as King of England. This treaty breaks down, wars in France continue, but the general population now more than ever view King John as being French with decidedly unpatriotic intentions. We're here in the church where they store the famous stag horns used in the Abbots Bromley horn dance. It's thought that the Abbots Bromley horn dance dates back to the days of the foresters and the hunting of the stag, and in the performance they do here they include Marianne, but they noticeably leave out Robin. You simply have an archer. The reason for this could be that the entire surrounding area, which is the Baggots Park estate, belonged in fact to the family and to Marianne herself, and it only became property of Robin when she married him. John is fighting in France throughout 1214. Meanwhile, the northern barons revolt and plot to kill the king, the outcome being Magna Carta in 1215. It is said that Robin Hood, now aged about 55, marched south under the banners of the northern barons to face King John. This forces King John to seal Magna Carta, a Bill of Rights for the barons, at Runnymede in June 1215. However, in September, a message from the Pope annuls the charter, and civil war starts over again, with John capturing Rochester and campaigning in northern and eastern England during December. 1216 sees John's fleet scattered in a storm and the French switch sides, joining the dissident barons. Then, on a march up the east coast, John famously loses the treasure in the Wash between King's Lynn and Newark. What can you tell me about the story of John losing his treasure in the Wash?
He was travelling back to King's Lynn and he fell ill. He fell very, very ill and decided to travel back to Newark Castle. And to do this, he went across the Wash. He went the longer but safer route, and that is where he famously is thought to have lost his treasure. Although there are other sources who disagreed with that, primary sources who said that he actually didn't have his treasure with him. He did have some of his relics. If we look at an abbot from Coggeshall, he actually said that he had his church, his relics with him rather than the actual treasure itself.
He pulls back to Swanshead Abbey, where he drowns his sorrows on peaches and new cider. Then on to Sleaford to the west and the Bishop of Lincoln's castle at Newark, where he dies after 3 days' unknown illness, possibly poisoning, on the 18th of October, aged just 48. Thus ended the life of one of Britain's most hated kings. Considering the territory through which John passes, it can be firmly implied that Robin Hood would have held his traditional forest realms as a baron against the king. After the death of King John, nothing is known of the life of the retired warrior Robin Hood. There are a few tantalising place names that develop over the years, one of which is Robin Hood's Well here in Yorkshire. We're inside a really unusual structure known as Robin Hood's Well that stands on the side of the modern day A1, the Great North Road, and it used to cover the original well where Robin was said to have watered his horses while travelling north. Unfortunately, that well is now underneath the carriageway. The present canopied structure was designed by the playwright architect Vanber in the early 18th century. But the well is recorded in the 15th century, along with Robin Hood's stone, which is now on the opposite side of the main highway, which was used as a boundary marker by the monks of Monk Breton, Barnsley, in a land document of 1422. In the tale A Little Jest of Robin Hood, there is one place in particular where Robin and Little John tend to rob people who are on the Great North Road, and that's here at Wentbridge. And Wentbridge is one of the few places where there is actually a blue plaque dedicated to an authenticated incident in a Robin Hood tale. One of those things that's tended to fool researchers is the fact that in The Little Jest of Robin Hood, the king is given as Edward. It's the only time it happens, but it might be due to the fact that at some point in Robin's later life he had a son, and the medieval tendency to name the son the firstborn after the father has tripped up those researchers for many centuries. The Robin Hood that we're talking about is the original Robin Hood of the 12th century. The one in that story is the Robin Hood of the 13th. There is no reason to doubt that Robin and Marian produced children, and that a son, Robin II, perhaps conceived during the 16 years at Malaset, would not have followed his father and lived to a similar age. Well, this is the famous grave of Little John at Heathersage, and about 300 years ago there was a gravestone at each end of it indicating its size, and now here in modern times, looking at this, it's got to be about 10 or 11 feet long, so it is pretty enormous. Little John wasn't that little after all, and still to this day it's maintained by the ancient order of foresters. This is interesting, this is probably one of the original stones that mark the grave site of Little John, and it appears to have a shield, and then the equal armed cross here, which we've taken to represent perhaps the Knights Templar, and then down here it's got L and tantalisingly an I, which used to represent J. So somebody at some point has marked it as perhaps the grave of Little John. The important bit we're missing though is that the border all the way around it here would have perhaps told us who was buried in this grave, but certainly it's identical to the early depictions of the grave of Robin Hood, so they're possibly from the same order. Up to about 150 years ago it was recorded that a very large fragment of Little John's bow had been preserved here inside the church at Heathersage. Unfortunately, it's no longer here, but that raises the question, are there any more of those English longbows surviving anywhere else in these counties? Well, actually, there are. These two fine examples came from a demolished tithe barn in South Yorkshire, and I have them in my own collection. Therefore, there must be other examples like these surviving out there somewhere. In the Life and Ballads of Robin Hood, Robin, aged about 87 and in poor health, retires to Kirklees Priory in Yorkshire, which is run by one of his female relatives. Here the decision is taken to release blood for the good of his health, but the attendant leaves him to bleed to death at the orders of Sir Roger of Doncaster, later known as Red Roger. It is said that Robin dies on the 18th of November 1247 and is buried alongside a nearby road about a bowshot from the priory, under a modern stone of the 1840s which reads, Here under this little stone lies Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. Ne'er archer were as he so good, and people called him Robin Hood. Such outlaws as he and his men will England never see again. However, this stone is clearly a fake. The real tomb is shown in an illustration by Nathaniel Johnson in 1665 and may have been moved to St Anne's Well in Nottingham around that time. The last three nuns resident at Kirklees Priory came to this site and started the Three Nuns public house. The reason for this was the number of pilgrims coming to visit Robin Hood's grave, which is in the trees at the back here behind the building. It just seems strangely appropriate that after all of his adventures and all of his travels, the now completely disappeared original burial site of Robin Hood should be at the back of this place, a traveller's rest. In reality, the name Church Lees simply means a church in a field. So it could be absolutely anywhere. In the 18th century, the antiquaries looked on the map and found a place called Kirklees, and that's why they chose this as his burial site. But actually, there are several other really good candidates. If we stick with the traditional name Kirklees that appears in most of the early Robin documents as the burial site for Robin, why couldn't it be Church Leeds? Well, if we go with Church Leeds, the nearest abbey church at which he may be buried is Kirkstall Abbey, just on the outskirts of Leeds. In Skelton's play, the actual words that Robin uses when he describes the place he wishes to be buried is at Wakefield, underneath the abbey wall. The closest actual abbey church to Wakefield is probably Kirkstall Abbey. Its founder Henry de Lacy is frequently connected to Robin Hood. It had direct connections to Fountains Abbey, where Robin's relics eventually ended up. It was developed within the lifetime of Robin, being founded on the 19th of May 1147, and it resides within the area of Leeds, which is Lees. It was formerly a Saxon church set in a woodland clearing named Kirkstole, meaning simply church place. If we stick to the name Kirklees, then this may be the most likely abbey being referred to. Only in legends after 1700 does Kirklees Priory take centre stage. Therefore it could be argued that the name Kirklees is actually quite a late addition to the Robin Hood legends. If we abandon Kirklees as a name and simply search for a suitable site somewhere in the vicinity of Wakefield, then another candidate may be Nostell Priory in the village of Ragby, located between Doncaster and Wakefield. Nostell Priory was a 12th century Augustinian foundation with Templar connections, dedicated to St Oswald and supported initially by Robert de Lacy of Pontefract, Thurston of York, William I Folliot, and later by King David of Scotland, all in the days of Robin Hood. Aldulf, the confessor to King Henry I, was the first known prior there in about 1114. While none of the priory now stands, this may be the closest monastic foundation to Wakefield being referred to in Skelton's play by the real Robin Hood. There is one clue to the burials at Nostell remaining in a nearby church. Inside the church resides a coffin and a coffin lid which was found by excavators in the grounds of Nostell Priory. The lid clearly depicts the cross of a Templar knight who may well also have been a forester. This provides us with another clue to the sort of burials that were made at Nostell Priory, and it may well represent the sort of burial Robin Hood had underneath the abbey walls. In 1547, Henry VIII commissioned the poet laureate of the day, Skelton, to write a play specifically for performance to the royal court, all about Robin Hood. Skelton then disappeared off to the archives, which we've now largely lost due to the dissolution of the monastery and the English Civil War. And in those archives he found all the information he could about Robin. And one really important fact came out of that, and that was Robin's wish to be buried in the Abbey Church at Wakefield. Having conducted all our investigations, do we therefore have a definitive burial site for Robin Hood? Well, yes, we do. There is one site that was under construction at the time of Robin's death, and that is the current Wakefield Cathedral. Recent excavations have clearly shown that there is in fact a 13th century church sat directly under the centre of the current building. As we investigated what initially appeared to be a modern structure, we discovered a lot of features inside the building that represent the medieval period, the period that would have been known by Robin. Standing in front of this magnificent modern altar, which is just behind the site of the original medieval altar, it's easy to feel the spirit of Robin permeating this magnificent medieval building. While it is our opinion that Robin rests below the floor here in Wakefield Cathedral, there are so many stories that have been tied to the legend of Robin Hood, and so many imitators that have followed him, that it may never be possible to definitively identify the remains of this great man.
Right! Which one of you miscreants is Robin Hood? Declare yourself Robin Hood and step forward now. Are you Robin, pretty boy? I know it's one of you. Declare yourself Robin Hood and step forward now. Step forward now!
I'm Robin. I'm Robin. I'm Robin.
I'm Robin.
I'm Robin. I'm Robin. I'm Robin.
He goes.